Hello children, welcome to your e-learning class, and today we would be covering the first part of your first chapter of geography, that is resource and development. In this first part, we would be covering the topics: the first, meaning of resource, then classification of resources, then development of resources, and then resource planning process. And while doing these topics, we would be covering their subparts as well. Now, first of all, let us understand what is the meaning of resource. Now, what is the meaning of resource? Everything that we use to satisfy our needs and which fulfills some of the conditions is called a resource. Now, what are the conditions that have to be fulfilled? First, technologically accessible. Second, economically feasible. And third, culturally acceptable. So now, when we produce anything which takes care of all the three things and becomes useful to us or satisfies our needs is called a resource. So I hope it's clear. A resource or a thing that we extract from nature becomes a resource when it is technologically accessible, economically feasible, and culturally acceptable. Right? Now, since we have understood the meaning of resource, let's understand the relationship between nature, technology, and institutions. Because whatever we use as a resource, it is extracted from nature. And how does it become a resource? Now we see the relationship between the three and how they are interdependent. Now, we extract something from nature or from a physical environment. So human is extracting something from nature, then making use of technology over it and creating institutions which develop some skills and at the same time help in economic development. So now let's understand the relationship between nature, technology, and institutions. They are all interdependent, and human beings interact with technology and create institutions for economic progress. Well, after understanding the meaning of resource, let's come down to the classification of resources. Now the resources are classified on different bases. We will be talking about the classification of resources under four bases. The first, on the basis of its origin. Second, on the basis of its exhaustibility. Third, on the basis of its ownership. And fourth, on the basis of its status of development. Now let's understand the first, that is on the basis of origin. Okay, the first, when we talk on the basis of origin, we further categorize the resources into biotic and abiotic. Now, what is biotic? Anything that has life is a biotic resource, like you have life in human beings, flora, fauna, fisheries, livestock, etc. And abiotic consists of the non-living things, which are, for example, rocks, metals, and so on. Now here on your screen, you can see some more examples of biotic and abiotic resources. Biotic, which is living; abiotic, that is non-living. Some of the examples that come under biotic are plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, whereas the examples that come under abiotic are water, sunlight, soil, air, temperature, and so on. Now, after covering the first classification on the basis of origin, let's come down to the next classification on the basis of exhaustibility. Now you have further divisions under the basis of exhaustibility, and let's see what are they. The first is renewable and the second is non-renewable. Very simple: renewable, that can be renewed; non-renewable, that cannot be renewed or take a very, very long time to be renewed. Now you have two categories under renewable, and they are continuous and flow. So now let's understand all of them separately: renewable, non-renewable, and then continuous and flow. Renewable, like that can be renewed from time to time, like for example crops, forests, solar energy. And non-renewable, which are difficult to renew in a short span of time or in your lifetime, like for example metals, fossil fuels, difficult to get them back in your lifetime. It will take millions of years to come back. Now on your screen, you can see some of the renewable and non-renewable resources. Some of the renewable energy or renewable resources are like solar energy, like hydropower energy, like wind energy. They can come back. You can keep using them even on a daily basis. Whereas non-renewable resources like fossil fuels, like coal, like natural gas, these things once exhausted do not come back soon, or maybe do not come back at all, like fossil fuels, like they don't come back. But coal takes millions of years to be reformed. So we categorize them or place them under the category of non-renewable energy or non-renewable resource. Well, when we were talking about the renewable resources, we talked about two more things under renewable resource, that is continuous and flow. Now let's understand the difference between continuous and flow, though they both fall under the renewable resource. Continuous resource, resources that are continuously available throughout without any obstruction. Then the availability of continuous resources is not affected by human consumption. For example, solar energy and wind energy and so on. Like solar energy and wind energy you get every day. They are continuous. The flow of these energies is continuous. So we call them, and it is not obstructed by anything, not obstructed by human consumption. We may consume it today, we consume it tomorrow, we consume it every day. Its flow is not affected. So we call it a continuous renewable resource. Now what is a flow? Resources that are available not in continuity and have obstruction in their availability. The availability of flow resources get affected by human consumption, and the examples given here on your screen are crops and forests. Now crops and forests are also renewable resources. You renew them, they come back to you, they keep coming back to you, but their flow is obstructed with the consumption of humans. If we keep consuming these things too much, it takes time to come back. So they have to be consumed in the right quantity. Forests will come back, crops will come back, but will take a little time. So depending on the consumption, if you over consume it, it takes time to come back. So now you understand the difference between continuous and flow, but they both fall under the renewable resources. Well, so far we covered two types of resources, one on the basis of origin and two on the basis of exhaustibility. Now let's come to the third type of resource, and that is the third classification of resource, and that is on the basis of ownership. So now, how do you classify, how do you categorize a resource on the basis of ownership? Ownership can be individual, ownership can be community, ownership can be national, and ownership can be international. Now let's understand each one of them separately with example. Resources on the basis of ownership, and the first is individual resource. Now what is an individual resource? Individual resource is something that is a personal resource, that is your own, that belongs to a single person. And for example, this can be a personal property, it can be your flat, it can be your plot, it can be your field. So all of this comes under individual resource, which is owned by a person or an individual. Next, we come to, on the basis of ownership, community resource. Now, what is community resource? It is also termed as a society resource, which is used by a community or a society or a group of people, like resources that are accessible equally to all the members of the community. And what could be the examples under this? Like parks, village playgrounds, could be grazing grounds, could be burial grounds. So all these places which are used or which are accessible to people of the community or the society is called a community resource. Now, after understanding personal resource and community resource, let's understand national resource. Now, what is a national resource? What do you understand by something national? National, your own nation. So, a resource that lies within a political land boundary of a nation and 12 nautical miles. Now, what is nautical miles? From the coast. Now, on your screen, when you see the map of India, you see that India has a huge coastline. So first, political land boundary. Political land boundary, you can see the political map of India and you can see all the resources, the minerals, and everything that lies within this political area belongs to India. That means it is a national resource of India. Now, how about the coastal area? So now, in order to clarify as to what, and these are big water bodies, so what area or how much of these water bodies or the resources inside these big water bodies belong to the national resource. So they are 12 nautical miles. You measure distance in water through nautical miles. So they are 12 nautical miles, and if we convert them into kilometers, it comes to 22.2 kilometers. So the area from the coast up to 22.2 kilometers, the resources that lie within this area in the waters belongs to the national resource. Now, how about the resources, the fisheries that are beyond this area? What do you call them? Let's see what are they called. Now, the resources that lie beyond the 12 nautical miles from the coast are called international resource. Now, the ocean resources beyond 200 kilometers of the EEZ stands for Exclusive Economic Zone. This belongs to international category, like for example, the fisheries in the international waters. So, this is an international resource that is beyond 200 kilometers from the coast. Now, after understanding resources on the basis of ownership, let's understand resources on the basis of status of development. Resources on the basis of status of development fall into the category of potential, developed, stock, and reserves. Now let's understand each one of them separately as to what is a potential resource, what are developed resources, what resource do we call as a stock resource, and what are the reserves. When we look at resources under the basis of the status of development, we find potential resource. What is a potential resource? Potential resource or the resources are which are found in a region but have not been utilized. Now, what is the example of this? Like we find a lot of wind energy and solar energy in the western part of India, that is specifically in Gujarat and Rajasthan. But we've not used these two resources to the optimum. So they fall under the potential resource. We have a lot of it, but we have not utilized it to its optimum. First. Second, developed resource. Now, resources which are surveyed and their quality and quantity have been determined for utilization. That means we survey, we find out that what resources are where. So we also find out how much of the resource and what quality of resource is there. And we also know that we will be utilizing them, or we are utilizing them. So they fall under the developed resources. Next, we come to stock resources. Now, materials in the environment which have the potential to satisfy human needs, but the human beings do not have appropriate technology to access them. For example, now you have a lot of hydrogen and a lot of oxygen in the air, but can you access it for different reasons? Do you have the technology to do that? Maybe not. So they fall under stock. For example, you have lots of minerals in the Himalayas and under the Himalayas. Do you have technology to access them? Maybe not. Maybe you have a lot of minerals in your nation, but you are not able to access them. So these minerals fall under the category of stock. And now, what are reserves? Reserves are a part of the stock which can be put into use with the help of existing technical know-how. For example, reserves. The water in the dams are reserves. Now we are using that water for hydroelectricity. We can use that water for irrigation or for other different purposes, which we may not be using right now at the same time. Right now, we may be only using dam to produce hydroelectricity, but when the need be, we will use that water for irrigation as well. So they fall under reserves. Similarly, we have a lot of forest, but not necessarily we are using all of it now. We might use it when we require. So these minerals fall under, or these resources rather, I'm sorry, fall under the reserves category of resources. I hope it is a little clear to you now as to what is a potential resource, what are the developed resources, what are stock resources, and what are reserves when we talk of resources. Okay, so far we covered two topics, uh, that is meaning and classification, and let's come down to the next topic, that is development of resource. So now we've already done development in our economics and we know what is development. So development to our understanding is progress, improvement, expansion, anything. Now, if we try to apply this development to our business, what would we understand? We want to expand our business, we want to progress in our business, we want to take it to the next level. So in order to do that, what do we require? Or for any kind of development, what is it that we require? The first thing that we require is resource planning. We can do it with good planning. We can go to the next level with good planning. Even if you want to apply it to your education, to your studies, to your performance, you can do it, you can develop with a planning. So the first thing that we require is planning. Now, how do we do resource planning? We do resource planning with careful utilization of resources in a sustainable way. Again, we are already familiar with this term of sustainability as well. Careful utilization, that means the resources that we have should be judiciously utilized. Why? Because we want to sustain them for our future generations. And what is the need for resource planning? Of course, sustainability is one, and let's see what more. To stop resources from depletion. If we do not use our resources in a judicious way, they will be depleted on a fast pace, and then we will be left with nothing. So it's very important to plan our resources so that they don't deplete really fast. Then, not to accumulate these resources into few hands. Now, supposing these resources are accumulated into few hands, so how would you use? If The resources like, for example, land, forest would be only concentrated in few hands. So would you be able to make use of those resources for human being in general, or for masses, or for all the people? So it is very, very important that when we are planning our resources, we need to see that they are not concentrated in few hands so that they are not exploited. Then, very, very important, why do we need to plan our resource? Very importantly, we need it to maintain ecological balance. If we disturb the ecological balance, it is going to fire back on us. Like you can see a bit of it these days when the nature is really healing itself and we had really tried to disturb the ecological balance. So you can actually experience it now. So when we talked about resource planning, we talked about sustainability. So now let's understand what is sustainable development. Now you've done this also in economics, but let us just recap. What is the definition of sustainable development? Sustainable development means that development should take place without damaging the environment, and the development in the present should not compromise with the needs of the future generations. That means whatever resources we are using for development, they should be sustainable, they should take place, but at the same time take care of the environment. One, and two, it should also take care of the future generations. We should not use them so much that we leave nothing for the generations to come. Now, in order to make progress towards sustainable development, we see that there was a first World Earth Summit in 1992, and the purpose of the summit was this was held in Brazil, and the name given to it was Agenda 21. And the purpose of this summit was to fight against socio-economic and environmental issues. That means taking care of the resources and at the same time taking care of the socio-economic and environmental issues so that these areas are not disturbed. Now, so far we've been talking about resource planning. Now let's see how are we going to plan this resource plan, or how are we going to do this resource planning. What is the process of this resource planning? First and foremost, we need to identify these resources, could be these minerals. So identification and inventory. So just identification is not sufficient. What do we do in the inventory? We do surveys, we map it, we see what is the quality of the resource, we see how much quantity of the resource is there, what is the estimation, and how it can be planned or used. After identifying and making an inventory, we come to the next step, that is evolving a structural plan. That means we have identified a resource, we know the quality and the quantity of the resource, but how are we going to make use of that resource? The use of that resource is going to be made with the help of technology and skill and institutions that are going to be set up to make use of that technology, and all of it together is going to add to the development or progress. Then this is not sufficient. We identified a resource, we made an inventory of it. We also saw that how this can be used technologically, what skills it requires, how we need to set up institutions to make use of them, but this is not sufficient. Again, the next very important step is we have to match the resource development plan with the national development plan. Like for example, we found out a resource of gold. Now, if we remember our previous slides and we remember that we need to keep in mind that these resources do not fall into few hands. Now, supposing this resource, mineral resource of gold, falls into few hands, that those few hands will exploit the resource to the maximum, which will actually benefit them. So what is the benefit of the nation? It is a national resource. It is found within the political boundaries of India. So matching the resource with the development plan of the national dev- uh, development plan is very, very important. So whatever resource we find out, if we develop that resource, we also need to see and match it how it is going to help in the development of the nation. Well, after covering all the topics of this first part of your first chapter, that is meaning, classification, development of resources, and resource planning, now the most important part and the conclusion that we come to now is conservation of resources. So we know what is a resource. We have also classified resources into different categories. We also know that how to develop a resource, and we also know what all to keep in mind while planning a resource. So now let's see how to conserve the resources, or why is it necessary to conserve the resources. Resources are very important for any kind of developmental activity. So if we want to further develop or see development in our nation, in our area, in our region, in our lives, it is very important that we have resources. But at the same time, irrational consumption and overutilization of resources may lead to environmental problems. So conservation at various levels is important. So we have resources. Any kind of developmental activity will require resources, but while using these resources, we have to see that we don't consume them more than required. We do not overutilize them, and see that this overutilization or irrational consumption of resources do not create havoc with the environment. That means we need to take care of the ecological balance along with. Now, this has been very well said by Gandhiji. Gandhiji emphasized this beautifully in the following words: there's enough for everybody's need and not for anybody's greed. So you have a lot of resources that will fulfill the needs of everybody, but only when utilized properly. It is not enough to satisfy anybody's greed. If you become greedy, you try to overutilize, then these resources will not be sufficient. So with this, we come to our first part of this chapter, that is resources, covering the different subtopics like the meaning, classification, development of resources, and resource planning. We will come up with our next part of this chapter, in which we would be covering land utilization or land resources. Okay, so take care and be safe till we come up with our next video covering the next part of this chapter.